Thank you for joining us today for session 2 of the Pulitzer Center series, The Coastal Southeast, Rising in Hazardous Waters. As we wait for people to join us in this webinar, please let us know in the chat where you're listening from. If you're joining us just now, just give us a little bit of info where you might be tuning in from. I'm Steve Sapienza. I'm Senior Strategist at the Pulitzer Center. What that means is I'm a member of the editorial team, and I also oversee the Connected Coastlines initiative. The Pulitzer Center, for those of you who have not joined us before, is a nonprofit journalism and education organization. We're supporting more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. And we have with us today 3 terrific grantees who you'll hear about their reporting projects in just a moment. We've developed a very strong K through 12 education through university programming that engages students on underreported issues across the globe. And we organize public events such as this one. Today, our conversation will address a range of issues related to water in the Southeast, including the threat of hurricanes and sea level rise to septic systems in Georgia, bacteria found in Charleston's floodwaters, and the impact of climate change on communities just beyond the beach in the Carolinas, and much more. Today's session features Pulitzer Center supported projects. These projects, the first are like I said, in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Waste in Georgia was published in collaboration between the Savannah Morning News and Georgia Public Broadcasting. Rising Waters was published by the Post and Courier in South Carolina, and Beyond the Beach was published by McClatchy Publications, the Raleigh News and Observer, and the State. That was just this week that came out, a big 7-part series, so look it up, it's tremendous. All of these reporting projects are part of the Pulitzer Center's nationwide Connected Coastlines initiative, which seeks to connect and enable local newsrooms in U.S. coastal states to report on climate science issues. And you can find all the links to all the reporting at our website. And I think one of my colleagues will put a link in the chat as well. So you can check those out. Just gonna give folks a little more time to join, and I wanna see where people are tuning in from. Chapel Hill, Seattle, welcome. Hilton Head, Beaufort, did I pronounce that right?
In North Carolina.
Depends on the state.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in South Carolina, it's Beaufort.
Thank you. Chapel Hill, Buffalo, New York, Amherst, Mass, Savannah, Georgia. Great to have you all. Cleveland. We, by the way, in the Connected Coastlines, we have a great series on the Great Lakes. So if you're in the range of the Great Lakes, please check that out. Okay, so in terms of the format, as people join, we'll first hear from each of our speakers, presenters, our grantees, about their reporting projects. And then I will ask them a few follow-up questions, and then we'll open the discussion for Q&A. And in order to ask questions, you'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. And feel free, as you hear the grantees speaking and you think of questions, feel free to begin adding your questions as soon as something comes to mind at any time during the conversation. And we'll look to get those questions answered. There's also a chat icon on your screen, and we'd appreciate it if you use the chat box only specifically related to tech issues. So if you're having an issue, you can put that in there, and we'll try to help. And also note that all attendees are muted, but if you cannot hear us, let us know in the chat box. We want to let you know that we are recording this session to post it online for others who were not able to join us today. And one final note, please remember to stay online once our conversation is ended today to learn about upcoming Pulitzer Center events and to participate in a brief survey. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. With us, we have Tony Bartelme, and Tony is a senior projects reporter for the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina. He has earned national honors from the Neiman, Scripps, Loeb, and National Press Foundations, and is a 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Tony and his colleagues recently launched an innovative new series called Rising Waters that aims to report on the impacts of climate change to their audience in the Charleston area in real time. You'll hear about more of that in a moment. And Sammy Fretwell. Sammy is an environmental writer for The State, a McClatchy newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina. His duties include covering the unfolding story of climate change, as well as energy, state environmental policy, wildlife and nature, and coastal development. He was named Journalist of the Year for 2017 by the State Press Association. And Sammy and his colleagues at the Raleigh News and Observer and The State, as well as reporters from the Columbia Journalism School and Center for Public Integrity, just launched a massive 7-part investigative series supported by the Pulitzer Center called Beyond the Beach, looking at the residents of the coastal plains in the Carolinas who are suffering from the inescapable effects of the world's climate change. Well, more on that in a moment. And Emily Jones. Emily is a public radio journalist based in Savannah, Georgia, where she covers the state's entire coast for Georgia Public Broadcasting. That means she tracks hurricanes, meets alligators, and increasingly is covering the impacts of climate change in coastal communities' efforts to protect themselves. Emily's work has appeared on NPR and Marketplace. And for Connected Coastlines, Emily teamed up with writer Mary Landers, who covers the environment for the Savannah Morning News, to investigate a hidden threat and fact of life for many coastal residents that's rarely discussed, and that is how increased precipitation poses a serious threat to septic systems. And I hope you and Mary had some decent hip waders on for that project. Welcome to everyone. And Emily, I think I'd like to turn it over to you to start to tell us a little bit about your reporting project.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having us here. I'm excited to be part of this panel. So to dive right in, to understand what septic systems have to do with sea level rise, you need to understand a little bit about how they work. And there it is, a graphic that you can see right now, which came from one of our sources we spoke to at the University of Georgia, really helps illustrate it. But the basics of it are, you flush your toilet, the solids stay in your septic tank where enzymes break them down. Liquid septage goes out into a drain field in your yard, which is engineered to filter out all of the harmful parts. And that drain field relies on having enough dirt for the septage to filter through so that it's clean by the time it reaches your groundwater. And you can kind of see where this is going. Higher groundwater levels reduce that separation, so you get less filtration, and unfiltered septage can get into your groundwater and also into whatever waterway might be nearby. And because this is talking about water that's underground, it's really a problem that can happen much earlier than some of the kind of more obvious above ground effects of climate change. Rising sea level is going to reach your underground septic system before it manages to flood your home. So with that basic idea in mind, I wanted to listen now to one of the homeowners that we talked to for our series, who had her septic system leaking into her yard. So this is Ashley Cooper Heath in Camden County, Georgia.
I got stuck right in the middle of the septic. Yes, stuck, and I can't get off the lawnmower because I'm in a wheelchair. So I was kind of sitting up there just going, oh, well, this stinks. No pun intended. And we actually had somebody come out and give us an estimate, and it was pricey. So we were like, okay, we'll work on it. It just won't be anytime soon. I believe it was 10 to 15,000 to get the septic fixed. Yeah. And you're like, of all things you really want to spend your money on. And I just never even, I didn't think about it. I knew that our septic was failing, but I didn't realize that the entire community where we live, the septics were failing. So everything was flowing down to the river without even thinking about it.
So from Ashley there, you can kind of hear how a lot of different problems intersect here. It was going to cost her $10,000 to $15,000 to replace her septic system, which who can afford that? I certainly couldn't afford that. And she couldn't either. And areas with septic also generally do not have sewer service. So it's never or almost never just like one random house with a failing septic tank. It'll be a whole neighborhood or a whole section of a county where every single house there is on septic, and all of those failing or potentially failing systems are going to end up getting their septage into the local water. So there's good news and there's bad news for Ashley's story in particular. The creek by her house has been so consistently contaminated for years and years because of all these failing septic systems that the county was actually able to get a grant to pump out the septic systems and to replace some of the ones that were really in the worst shape. So she's got a new system. It's working great for them. The water testing shows in the area a clear drop off in the contamination as a result of this program where they're replacing the septic systems. The bad news is that in most cases, you can't really show that really clear line from septic systems to a bad contaminated waterway. A part of that is because many places do not test their water. We visited another neighborhood outside Savannah that's really similar to Ashley's. The yards all back up to the water. Everyone there is on septic, and there's pretty regular flooding in their yards, but there isn't any water testing there. So we don't know for certain whether the waterway right behind those houses is contaminated the same way that the creek in Camden County is. And without that kind of clear evidence, or also without just, really consistent high contamination levels, it's hard to get the kind of funding that Camden County did, where they were able to inspect and pump out and replace the septic systems. Because really, it takes money. So really what we've found out in this project is that even if you know where your septic systems are, which Georgia does, and even if you find a way to require that people get their septic systems inspected, which at least some Georgia counties do, for most people, it's really just too expensive to fix a compromised septic system unless there's some kind of help from a grant or from the county or from somewhere.
Who's just quick couple follow-up questions. Whose responsibility is it, or is it the states or the local government responsibility to test the waters in that area?
I think Department of Public Health are the ones that do the testing, at least in Camden County. But it's just, and I mean, I'm talking about, the water in a creek or a river, right, or something like that. I'm not talking about like drinking water coming out of a tap.
Sure.
But yeah, there just isn't necessarily a program where, somebody goes around and tests that water. In some cases, some organizations like, river keepers will sometimes do that sort of work. But again, they don't all do it, and they don't all do it for every single little creek and every single little stream. In an area where we have a lot of those in coastal.
Yeah. I'm just curious, you mentioned the enormous cost of replacing one of these systems. Is there some way to, like, this is happening, I take it, with more frequency? And is there any way to future-proof a septic system? And can people afford that?
By future-proof, you mean guard against like the rising sea level? So it's kind of, this is another problem that we ran into a lot in our reporting, is that in a lot of cases, they're sort of so far behind on bringing those systems into compliance that like you don't even necessarily think about the future. There's currently you are required to have 2 feet between your drain field and the groundwater level. And a lot of systems are older than when that regulation was put in place. So now, I mean, if you were to get a new septic system and, replace your drain field, you would need 2 feet of separation from the current groundwater level, which is higher than it used to be in a lot of places. But I mean, it would require, I guess, a new regulation to require people to plan for a future groundwater level, because right now that doesn't exist, where you're required to have 2 feet not just from the current level, but from what it might be.
Are there other solutions for homeowners that are?
There are some other kinds of septic systems that do sort of a more active kind of filtering, although they are very expensive. And then, you know, the other kind of solution would be a sewer system tap in. Of course, sewer systems also have you know, problems with climate change, and they have kind of a similar situation where they have, you know, existing problems that they're trying to sort of catch up on fixing. And the case with the sewer system is, you know, again, these areas where, you know, a whole neighborhood is on septic are usually they're usually somewhere sort of removed from like the, you know, the core center of the city where there's a sewer system that runs everywhere. So you have to run a sewer line out to that neighborhood, and that costs a ton of money. So somebody has to pay for that too. And all of the, you know, all the people in that area have to kind of buy in that they want that sewer line to come out. So again, we looked at another neighborhood, again, kind of similar to Ashley Cooper Heath's. The water's not far away. All the houses are on septic. And there are some residents there who are really pushing for a sewer line to come out, but it's not all the residents. You know, the neighborhood is sort of divided on it. So, you know, without that buy-in, without everybody saying like, yes, I want a sewer line and I am willing to pay for this sewer line to come out here, that kind of has to wait until, you know, they're able to get funding to send the sewer line out there.
Got it. Got it. I think you may have answered a question right there that was posed. Thank you so much. We'll come back to Georgia and the septic systems there, but let's move up the coast to Tony Bartelme in Charleston. Tony, why don't you give us a little overview of the story that you worked on with your colleagues, and what drove you to take this innovative approach to the storytelling and the approach to getting in the water and doing the work with your test kit.
Well, thanks, Steve, and hello, everybody. I just wanted to let everybody know that this virtual background behind me is what I look like, what I see sometimes when I walk out my front door. So I literally don't have to go very far to do some reporting. Charleston and really throughout South Carolina, as Sammy will tell you, has been hammered year after year, especially in the past 5 years, with one crazy storm after another. And we're seeing all of these sort of direct and indirect impacts from a rapidly changing climate here in what we call the Low Country. So with that context in mind, we decided earlier this year to launch a major project called Rising Waters, in which we report some of these flooding rains and these sunny day tides as breaking events, as the breaking events that they are, but also drop in investigative and contextual pieces, explanatory pieces, when everybody's attention is focused on all the water around them. So we've been doing a series of stories every time it really rains, or we have some super high tides, as we did last week and the week before, or the month before. And as part of that project, and thanks in part to the Pulitzer Center's support, which we really appreciate, we decided to go out and sample what's in water that surrounds our areas when there's a flooding rain. And we sampled for bacteria, and specifically fecal type bacteria, E. coli. And a team of us donned waders and had special kits created to go into these areas that flood pretty deeply. And we sampled the water. And what we found was just, in a word, disgusting. With the levels were in some areas, and just in this particular area, it's a low-income neighborhood near the medical district, 60 times what is acceptable in a lake. So 60 times. So if this was a lake, our state health and environmental agency would have to shut it down. So, and this was, we found in one place after another, there were very, very few places that had levels that were low or below what's acceptable. And one interesting finding was that we found that not only did this happen during flooding rains, but we also found this bacteria levels were very high when on a perfectly sunny day, when we had an abnormally or unusually high tide, although these tides are actually becoming the norm. We can talk about that more. So whether it was sunny, whether it was rainy, these flooded waters were really crawling with stuff that can make you sick.
What is the science background that you needed or is necessary for reporters to sample contamination in the water? What did you have to do? What was the process?
Yeah, that's a good question, Steve. So I had long conversations with some scientists at the College of Charleston who have done this work before, and it's not that complicated to sample. You have to you should protect yourself. You shouldn't go in and just scoop the stuff up. You should wear waders, and then you should take a shower afterward. You should wear gloves. That one picture just showed me not having gloves, so I violated the standards there. But so yeah, basically we talked to scientists who told us how to collect the samples in a proper way. We worked with a lab north of the city that also gave us the correct protocols to do this kind of work. And then we went in and just followed the rules. So there's a little bit of a window to take samples. You have to, you can't, so once you take a sample, you basically have 8 hours to get it to a lab. Any longer, then the samples are no good. And you have to put them in an ice pack during that period, or the bacteria will grow on its own and you'll have a bad result. And so then we would scramble during a rainstorm, and we would gather all these things, all these samples. And we were doing this at a time when the city was just in complete disarray. I mean, your cars are going through these puddles, they're getting stalled. There's traffic backs up all over the place, as well as sewers. And pretty soon, we're sort of scrambling to get all these samples in one place and then deliver them to the lab, which is about 30 minutes north of us, before they close. So it was kind of maybe the worst treasure hunt ever.
Well, looking at the photo behind you and looking at the photos in the reporting that show you and people who live in these different neighborhoods, you guys fanned out across the city. Do you find there's different levels of awareness in different neighborhoods about the dangers in the water?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. So some people are clearly concerned about it and are very careful. Then there are others. There are a lot of college kids who see it as a big party, and we've taken pictures of guys floating in these little flamingo floats that you might see in a pool. We saw a guy. I think we have a video of a guy being towed on a surfboard being towed by another car. I've seen a guy windsurf. I've seen a guy jet ski on streets, and they really shouldn't be doing that. For a lot of
what has been the reaction from readers of the stories? Have you heard anything from city officials about the reporting that you've highlighted?
Well, we're in a way, we're kind of embarrassing the city and the state into kind of taking a look at this. So nobody measures this stuff. Our state health department, they don't measure it. They just say stay out. Our city doesn't measure it. They just say stay out. But we've kind of guilted some folks into doing some additional testing, and beyond that, I don't know. We'll see. I think the stories sort of speak for themselves.
And yet the flooding's happening with more frequency. Can you explain to those of us not from the region, why is the flooding happening more frequently? What are some of the drivers?
Charleston has always been, it sits squarely in what's called the low country, and it's because the land is very low lying. However, our flooding has grown noticeably worse in the last few decades, really in the last decade especially. And the drivers behind that are rising sea rise, and then also these stronger storms that are fueled by warmer temperatures in the atmosphere. The warmer the atmosphere, the more moisture it can hold, which means the more rain a rainstorm can dump. So where we used to have we might have a storm with a couple of inches, we might have a rain dump of 6 or 7 inches within a few hours. And there's not much you can do when that happens, when you have an aging infrastructure like we do.
Quick question from Hal Scott Davis. Despite these observations about flooding in Charleston, Charleston remains a popular tourist destination, and property values have appreciated. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's still, there are 30 some odd people moving here every day, and it's becoming an ever more popular tourist destination. That's very correct. So yeah, will there be a tipping point at some point where people stay away? We're not there yet. But if the disruption is such that you have something like this, every other day, we'll see what happens. But so we used to have just a few flooding events a year. And in the last 5 years, we've been seeing 50 to 80 a year.
A stark increase. And you in your reporting described something called a rain bomb. Could you tell us what that's about, and is that something that's occurring with more frequency as well?
We use the term rain bomb a little loosely. The meteorologists will get upset with us sometimes when we use it, but we kind of have a rain bomb to us is a storm that dumps an enormous amount of rain in a very short period. And we've seen storms come in and flood areas within 30 minutes. 6 inches of rain per hour coming down. Huge, just burst of water.
And this is relatively new, not something that used to happen very frequently in the past.
Yeah, it's just, we're seeing it more and more. There's been something like a 20%, 27% increase in the amount of sort of flooding rains in the Southeast. So it's a regional problem. It's a national problem. It's even worse in the Northeast.
Thank you for that. And definitely, if you have questions for any of our speakers, put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them. We're going to stay in the region here and go to Sammy Fretwell to talk a little bit about give us an overview maybe of the Beyond the Beach project that just launched this week. And this reporting, you can see it in McClatchy newspapers in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And it's got some real eye-popping reporting on the effects of rising temperatures and seas. So Sammy, could you give us an overview?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. We're talking about what we could do about climate as a regional news gathering organization. And we thought one of the most interesting aspects of climate is how climate change is how it's affecting health. And so we kind of took that as our theme and kind of fanned out and started looking. And we found basically farm workers in North Carolina were suffering mightily from increasing heat. The temperatures at night are warmer. They're sleeping in unair conditioned bunkhouses. And there's not really any oversight to help protect these people, perhaps the way there is in other states. We also took a look at mold and how that's affecting people's health. In North Carolina's coastal plain, this is a picture right here taken in South Carolina of a house that a family had to abandon. That's the guy that lived in the house. And they had to get out because they kept getting flooded out and rained on so much that nothing ever dried out, and this mold just continued to grow. We're looking at this picture right here. I'll just tell you about it real quick. This guy was having problems with mold, he thought, and the story I got was that when he pulled the paneling down off the walls, this is the kind of stuff he saw behind the walls. Just a sad story because this is a community that's not very affluent. It's very small. The Sellers, South Carolina, has got like 200 residents in it, and people don't have a lot of means to deal with this mold. We couldn't find anything that showed that they were getting a lot of federal or state help with this. Apparently there are programs, but somehow there's a disconnect. And so this mold problem was, the climate aspect of it is that, you know, they keep getting pounded by these hurricanes. I mean, 3 hurricanes in 5 years. And this year, Marion County, South Carolina, where this is near the North Carolina border, has already surpassed its rainfall totals. I think the county's gotten something like 54 inches of rain, and the normal is somewhere around 44, 45 in a year. And, you know, we're not even done with a year. And so these folks are really suffering over there. And it seemed like a real stark example of how the changing climate is threatening people's health. I know in this community, there are several people who have died. And of course, it's hard to prove anything, you know, they had other health conditions, but their family members seem to feel like that the exposure to mold had contributed to their health problems. We had one guy who had an older fellow with some health problems. He had moved out of his house and his health improved, and according to his daughter. And then when he went back to his house, because he just missed it, his health started to go downhill again. So, you know, these are things you can't, you know, there's not 100% proof of it, but this is what folks there are saying. So we looked at mold. One of my colleagues, Len Bonner, looked at it in North Carolina and found that it was more, that asthma problems were more pervasive in the coastal plain of that state. And she took a look at mold from that aspect, how it was affecting asthma in these communities. You know, one of the biggest aspects of this story was the series of stories was about Vibrio, which is a microbe that's found in coastal waters. This is a picture at Edisto Beach, about 50 miles south of Charleston. And in this area, there was a fellow who was crabbing a few years ago, or he's out fishing, and he went to check some crab traps. That's the guy right there. He's sitting in the front of the boat there. And he checked the crab traps, and a crab pinched him on the hand. And he's like, and I shook it off, not a big deal. And he was dead within 10 days. And the doctors are telling us that this is highly consistent with a Vibrio vulnificus infection. And the family was pretty clear that they had been told it was Vibrio. And it was a really sad story, because this guy just, you know, like anybody else, he's just going down to the beach to have a nice vacation with his friends. And the next thing he knows, he's in the hospital. He's got all kind of health problems, and you know, and they ended up killing him. So this Vibrio bacteria, to step back for a minute, there are a lot of different varieties of it. Most of them are not as dangerous as the one that infected this guy. But those toxic kinds are nothing to mess around with. Vibrio vulnificus is probably the worst. Vibrio parent hemolyticus is one that you find a lot in shellfish. So if you eat raw shellfish, you can get pretty sick if this is infecting that shellfish. Those are two of the most powerful toxic types. And what we found was that this is an increasing threat, that more and more people are reporting Vibrio-related illnesses. We got a lot of data from states. This was through Columbia Journalism Investigations Program that helped us out with this. And we basically analyzed the numbers here, the data, and it was pretty clear that these cases are rising. And that at the same time, we're finding these scientific studies that are showing that Vibrio is exploding in growth at certain times, like after hurricanes. A researcher at North Carolina found a substantial increase in Vibrio concentrations after one of the recent hurricanes. And she also did a 10-year study that showed that Vibrio was the overall Vibrio concentrations were rising over that 10-year period. So the evidence is there that it's becoming more of an issue. It's not something that you need to just, it's not an epidemic or anything like that at this point, but it's something to note because you've got warmer water, you've got salt water moving around in places that hadn't been before, making conditions right for this microbe. And you've got more people that are reporting illnesses. So we felt like this was an important way to kind of illustrate how climate change is affecting people's health. So that was our project, and so we had basically those elements. We had heat affecting farm workers, we had asthma, we had Vibrio, and we had this mold issue in this small town. So that's kind of the overview.
Thank you for that. And with regard to the Vibrio, can you talk about the conditions in the water that have changed that are kind of making it more suitable in a way for to grow?
Yeah, what we found is that the most toxic types of Vibrio that we found out about, particularly vulnificus, is it likes brackish water, and so that's the key. Is you got these rising sea levels, and it's pushing salt water farther up into rivers that are normally fresh. It's just a slow, steady drumbeat. Sometimes, though, hurricanes will send storm surges farther up, and it'll be like a quick pop. But collectively, these rivers are getting the conditions for this in places it's never been seen before are getting better. On the flip side, when it's pouring down rain after a hurricane, like one of these rain bombs that Tony was talking about a minute ago, there's so much rain that comes down, it can push a surge of fresh water closer to the ocean and dilute the salt content near the ocean, again making it suitable for Vibrio vulnificus. So you're seeing these kind of things happen, and conditions appear to be improving for that. Unfortunately, the one thing that we did note was there was a study done at the University of South Carolina a few years ago that found Vibrio vulnificus more than 20 miles up a river that's normally fresh water. And that was pretty eye-opening to a lot of folks.
This is a question that I'd like each of you to consider, and just I'm curious about what local governments are doing to raise awareness or to warn people about the various hazards in the water that you all are describing. Emily, do you have anything from Georgia?
I don't know that this in Georgia has reached the level yet of warning people about the hazards in the water. In Florida, they are seeing pretty regular problems with what is very obviously septage showing up in their water from old and compromised septic tanks. One thing I will say in Georgia, though, is I mentioned that some counties require people to have their septic tanks inspected, and that's actually something that the way that they do it, the Department of Public Health can't say, like, they don't have the mandate to say everyone who has a septic tank is required to get the septic tank inspected. But what some counties have started to do is to tie that to some kind of service that they do provide. So Camden County, which I talked about a little bit, has made a move where they tie your trash pickup to septic inspection. So like if you are, if you're a new homeowner and you come in and you say you buy a house and it has a septic tank, you're not going to be able to set up your trash service unless you're able to say that you've had your tank inspected. And some other places do that with other municipal services or utility services like electric, with the idea being that, at least every time a place changes hands, you end up inspecting the septic tank. That doesn't solve the problem of how you replace it, but it is one step that governments are taking to try to get people to stay more on top of their septic systems. Because, I mean, even not thinking about the climate change portion of it and the sea level rise portion of it, a problem with septic systems kind of in general is that they're out buried in your yard. You don't really think about them until your yard floods or your toilet backs up or your sink backs up. And really you're supposed to get your system pumped once a year or once every 3 years, depends on the system, depends on the regulations. But the point is you're supposed to do regular maintenance on it. So one thing you can do is kind of require people to do that maintenance as a way to sort of try to stay on top of the problem. And this is not an answer to your question, but I did want to note, because I kind of forgot to say earlier when you asked about if there's a way to kind of get ahead of the sea level rise. And I was talking about how nobody really requires you to do that, but there is, if you do, replace your septic drain field, you can put in what's called a mounded system, where like normally you would bury the drain field in the ground. And, if you put a mound of dirt on top of your yard and put the drain field in that does give you some added separation. And in some places you do have to do that just to get the 2 feet that's regulated. But I did just want to kind of clarify there is a way to sort of build up the septic system so that it's farther away from the groundwater.
Got it. I just want to encourage people to ask questions in the Q&A of our panelists, and I've got one here from Theodore Jablonski. Are you aware, and I think this could be to you, Emily, but others, this may apply. Are you aware of any serious movement to restrict commercial or residential development in the most affected areas where you reported? Is there a regional approach to this, a statewide approach, or is it up to local municipalities?
For now in Georgia, it's any effort like that would be local. I haven't seen anything at kind of a statewide or regional level trying to kind of discourage development, I guess. Again, the way that any sort of restriction on that comes in, I guess, would be in either permitting to allow somebody to put in a new septic system or to allow, a new subdivision to tap into a sewer line. And, so either the Department of Public Health that regulates people's septic systems or the local water sewer authority in whatever county or municipality you're in would be the ones that kind of say, yes, we have sewer capacity for you to build a subdivision there, or no, we don't. But I wouldn't say that there's any sort of concerted effort to kind of stop new development because of climate change. At least not here, not yet.
I'd like to ask a question about media coverage of climate issues. All of you have worked on these terrific projects to highlight these issues. Just wondering, the total volume of reporting, if you look at coverage of climate, is pretty low. Just wondering what your thoughts are on, the media's responsibility or challenges of covering the climate crisis or issues.
Well, I'll take that. That's a great question, and I think one of the big challenges of doing environmental reporting, climate change reporting is that it's often involves very complex issues that take a lot of time and work to do and to tell stories in a compelling way. And so that's, I think, the biggest challenge is coming up with stories and doing them in ways that continually engage our readers. And so I agree. I mean, it's I think the most important issue of the day, and we should be doing much more.
You know, I've found actually so many of my stories now, even if they're not a climate story per se, climate is an element of that story. You know, it's how you know, it's just the reality of the day. I mean, if you're writing about you know, some kind of contamination issue, there's always some kind of climate element to that. You know, heavier rains, how's that affecting things, that type of thing. So I just find it's almost inescapable to write an environmental story these days without mentioning climate in some way. So I think that my sense is that the climate coverage has increased at newspapers, say in the past, certainly in the past 20 years, but even in the past 10. I know that's been the case with me. I'm more aware of it now than I was at one point in the past. So I think there's an improvement. I think there's more need for it, and there's also need for it in a contextual way. I mean, Tony's right. These are complicated issues, and they take some time to really drill into and explain in a relevant way.
I mean, I would agree with what both Tony and Sammy said. You know, I definitely think there is more coverage and more focus on climate, you know, and obviously we're three journalists who focus on this a lot. So, I mean, I don't know about you two. I feel like I'm always saying like, I want to cover this environmental story. I want to cover this climate change story. But, you know, I do think that one issue we run into though is, you know, as this topic, this, you know, sort of broad umbrella of a story is becoming more and more important. I mean, we're also seeing a lot of newsrooms shrink. You know, a lot of newspapers have much less staff than they did even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20. And public radio is a little different, but we're kind of always running with, we'd love to have more people. So I think if anything, the challenge that I at least run into is less that I think there's interest in climate coverage, but there's not always personnel to do it, or there's not always, you know, there's not always room on the front page or time in the on-air clock for it when there's so much news happening, and you know, people need a relatively small team needs to cover all of that news that's happening.
I think Emily makes a really good point there. You know, and I think that was one of the things that was nice about this McClatchy initiative is we worked with multiple organizations, including the Pulitzer Center, and you know, it was a pretty good collaboration between the Raleigh News and Observer and the state in Columbia, and we were able to kind of pool resources and do this. So you know, that's one way to address this when you're kind of stretched for resources.
Yeah, and that was true of our project too, with you know, both me and the resources of our newsroom and Mary and the resources of the Savannah Morning newsroom. It does help to collaborate, and that helps you bring in, you know, the expertise of multiple people and the, you know, editors from different newsrooms and all of that kind of thing to kind of spread out the workload a little bit.
One more, another question in terms of coverage and how people talk about climate change. I'm curious, in the communities that you went to and reported on, that people, did they talk about global warming? Do they talk about climate change? What do they see as the reasons for, you know, increases in mold, Vibrio, flooding, you know, these types of things?
Well, I can tell you about, you know, let's talk about mold for a minute. You know, all the folks in Sellers, South Carolina knew was they're getting pounded by rains. They're not analyzing why this is happening. They're not, not necessarily sure why it's happening. You ask them about it, and yeah, it's climate, so they do know about it, but that's not the thing they're sitting there pondering. What they're pondering is the fact that there's water in their yard, and there's water under their house, and there's mold growing. And it's kind of the same thing with the Vibrio story. Guy goes to the beach, gets pinched by a crab. I mean, he's not thinking about climate change. I mean, it's not, people, I think, are relating to climate change without connecting the big picture to the actual issue that they're dealing with. And I think that's just human nature. I mean, I probably do the same thing myself. So that's my sense of it, or my take on it.
Yeah, I would say in Charleston, we experience the effects so viscerally that it's, it's pretty top of mind for some people. And then there's a significant, I would say, minority that doesn't think it's related to climate change. So yeah, I think you have a mix of people, but we've been sort of hammered. It's year after year. We've had 6 years, like 6 years in a row, where we've had either a hurricane or some sort of flooding rain that was, affected our area in a real way. So you just like that constant drip of pain is, I think, opening some people's eyes.
Another question related to development in Charleston. Karen Dunn says, Charleston continues to develop every available piece of property on the peninsula, adding even more impervious surfaces. What requirements or innovative best management practices are being employed to reduce stormwater, non-point pollution that is likely contributing to hazardous water conditions?
A great question, and a lot of people talk about that. Development is making things worse, and they're right. You cut down trees, you pave parking lots. You are going to create more stormwater, and that stormwater is going to be concentrated, and it's going to flow faster and create all sorts of havoc. So our stormwater rules in the past have been pretty lame and haven't done much. And we've had new stormwater rules in various municipalities that are much stronger than they used to be. But I think there's still a big gap between what's effective and what could be effective. There's, I think, a very real failure to appreciate the value of forested open space and its ability to sop up all these flooding rains. And, so you have that, and then you have a bunch of developers coming in, creating these just gigantic subdivisions north of our city in very low areas, just eating away at that sponge that prevents a lot of this flooding. So that's a really important issue that we'll be addressing, we'll be working on for sure for a long time.
And a question from Ben Curran. Are you aware of any major climate change report that discusses the wide range of activities NGOs, governments, et cetera, are taking to raise awareness and propose solutions? So maybe a national report or even regional reports that you all have seen that talk about solutions or other ways to prepare or anything like that.
Well, I would say that solutions issue is, it can be kind of complicated like everything else. I mean, what you have going on in South Carolina is you have a floodwater commission, for instance, that's been formed by the governor to try to address flooding. The idea is how can we mitigate flooding? Everything from building new lakes to store stormwater to putting in artificial reefs off the coast to try to prevent storm surges from affecting the area. That report has been criticized by a number of former state natural resources officials and others as being kind of short-sighted. I mean, it depends on who you talk to. And then the larger issues, you see a number of individuals, groups saying, the answer is to try to figure out some way to address carbon and the things that are causing climate change. That's a big order because you can't do it alone in a state like South Carolina or North Carolina. But there's a feeling that just more needs to be done in that respect. So that's kind of those are just a couple of things that I've heard or run across in recent years. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tony?
I mean, it's a kind of a broad question. I don't think there's really any real sort of definitive sort of pivotal document out there that's really guiding anybody's actions yet.
Another question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just
No,
going to
go
say,
ahead.
with regard to the solutions issue, I think I feel like I'm seeing reporting and also like journalism and also, sort of nonprofit advocacy kind of organizations push lately to try and turn toward proposing solutions. But I think most of the big reports that we see that come out on climate change are still very much focused on like trying to drive home how serious the issue is and what a big problem it is and how we need to do something, so I don't know that there's any kind of like centralized report taking stock of the solutions, because a lot of the centralized reports are kind of taking stock of the problem and still trying to raise the alarm that like, hey, this is a existential issue that we need to address,
In terms of raising awareness and getting people to think about this issue, what do you all think is the most important factor in changing attitudes in the Southeast? Is it observing impacts? Is it the way it's reported? Is it related to political messaging that's happening? What's an important factor in changing attitudes?
I think the attitudes won't change until there's a sort of economic pain that kind of connects the dots between what we're seeing on the ground and the larger forces of climate change. So I think as soon as you start seeing businesses get involved and see the threat to their livelihoods, people's real estate, their homes, banks maybe looking 20 or 30 years out and seeing, oh, maybe that house will be in a flood zone. That I think will lead to more political and larger change.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's how you're affected. I mean, there are big picture things that everybody needs to be worried about, but when it's actually affecting you, it seems like it increases the urgency to do something about it.
And I think it's our job to connect the dots.
Yeah, I mean, in a similar vein, I think seeing the undeniable real world effects, like the very frequent flooding in Charleston, here in Savannah, the one road out to Tybee Island floods all the time, and we've also had some pretty serious hits from hurricanes in the last few years, which we went for a very long time without seeing significant hurricane effects. And now all of a sudden we've had, several boom, boom, boom right in a row. So I think that makes it hard for people to deny that something is happening, that, that hurricanes keep hitting us and we keep flooding. But yeah, I mean, I would agree with Tony that as far as, changing attitudes in a long-term way, I think those kinds of long-term and economic effects are probably what it would take. And also that, yeah, it requires us and other people, not just, journalists, but also, leaders and scientists and everybody saying, this hurricane wasn't random. It was, bigger than it might have been in the past because of X, Y, and Z and because of climate change.
Well, you're right, though, and it is a responsibility of the media to make those connections, and there are plenty of connections to make. So, yeah. I agree.
I think we have time for one more question. Has Charleston flooding reached the point where access to MUSC, which I think is the medical university, is compromised?
Yeah, definitely. And so the Medical University of South Carolina, it's really a hospital cluster. It's one of the most, if not the biggest hospital cluster in South Carolina. tens of thousands of people work there and patients go there. And on a very high tide, 3 sides of it are surrounded by water. During a flooding rain, some parts are inaccessible, including the entrance to the emergency room. In fact, it's gotten so bad that the MUSC has acquired some military personnel carriers to ferry employees to and from the hospital during hurricane type of surge.
Well, on that unbelievable note, I think we're going to have to end it here. I thank you all for the tremendous reporting that you've done and continue to do on this subject, and for your contributions to the broader conversation about these issues. And want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank in particular my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Kayla Edwards, who has been our producer for this session. I also want to thank the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Department of Science Education and the One Earth Fund for supporting our Connected Coastlines reporting and events like this one. We appreciate all of you joining us and asking questions today. And for those of you who are able, please consider supporting our mission with any level of contribution. We are a nonprofit journalism organization, and so we do depend on donors to carry on our work. Next Thursday, the Pulitzer Center will continue its Focus on Justice series. This will be October 29th at 4 p.m. Please join us for a virtual performance and conversation with Lisa Jessie Peterson, a self-described artivist who uses her work as an actress, playwright, and a poet to advocate for incarcerated populations through both art and teaching. Please register for next Thursday's session at pulitzercenter.org. And of course, feel free to share this event widely with your friends and colleagues. Please stay with us a few more minutes and take a brief survey after we officially close today's session. And thanks again for everyone for participating and joining us, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.